All right, we're going to talk about doing a fixed layout using some columns. This is going to be a fixed layout. That means it's not going to change when we change our browser size. We're going to use a set number of pixels in width. We're going to learn more about fluid layouts later on, layouts that will adjust with the size of the screen, which is good, especially when we get to mobile. But when we talk about that, we're going to talk about a few more advanced things, and we're going to look at some frameworks that go along to make that process a little bit easier. But we're going to start with this layout that we're looking at right here. And it's a very common layout. You see this on the internet a lot. One of the things that you don't see, though, is this container up here. So this involves having a container on our page. The outside lines are from our body. The container is in our body, and inside the container we have a header. Oops, excuse me, I didn't mean to go. We have a header section. Here's a nav section that contains links for navigation. We see something over here called an aside. And then over here is a section. And down at the bottom, we have a footer. All right. So HTML5 started including, and I've talked a little bit about it in the past, the semantic web. Let's start naming things what they are. Let's use names for things that describe what they are, even if those things don't do anything. So the aside by itself doesn't do anything. This section over here that's called main doesn't really do anything. The container doesn't do anything at all as far as our content is concerned. It's just a way to organize our content. Once our content is organized, and remember, each one of these things that we're going to have here is the box, and it follows the box model. We can use floating and some of the techniques we learned about the box model last week in order to organize and make our things go where we want them to go and give our page a much better layout than what we've been able to do in the past. So the first thing we need to do is construct the basic structure for this without any content. I'm not going to put any content in it. Let's just go over here to our editors. And let's try to make that content. Let me see if I can pull this. I'll put it right here. We won't do any previews yet. We'll just go over here and try and make this content. Now remember, everything is inside the container, and the container is inside the body. Right? So we're going to use the div tag. And we're going to give it an ID. Of container. Okay. Now you see this a lot of times, often called wrapper. So people use container and wrapper. So a wrapper is a section that wraps everything else in the page, or a container is something that contains everything else in the page. We're going to use that container to set the width of our page ultimately. So you might see the words wrapper. We're going to use the word container, but remember they're the same thing. And if we have a div, we need a /div. So let's get that structure. Everything else here is inside our div, right? That container is in the body. So the body begins and ends here. Our div begins and ends there. All these other things, the header, the nav, the aside, the main section, and the footer are going to be inside this container. So let's go ahead and make some. So I've already explained in the old days, we would do something like div, the old days, and say ID equals kind of like we did with the container, but we do it with the header, right? But we started doing that so much. I don't know why they didn't do it with container or wrapper, but they didn't. So rather than using a div with an ID of header, we can just use the word header now. And we have to have a slash header. Right. Now this can get confusing, especially the header can get really confusing. We have a head section up here, right? We have this header tag that we use for the header of a page now. It's just a container that holds things. It doesn't really do anything special on its own. And we also have headings. So we have a head section, we have headers, and then we have our headings H1, H2, H3 up to H6, right? So don't get those terms confused. So we're going to have a header. We're going to have a nav section. So let's create that. There's my nav and there's my slash nav, and everything in our nav section will go inside that set of tags. We're going to have an aside section. So these are common names for sections of a page that we use all the time. And remember, they're no different than a div. They don't do anything on their own. We can apply styles to them to make them work for us. And they're just a good descriptive name for what they do, rather than use the old technique of a div with an ID. So we have aside. We're going to do a section. And we can have more than one section. And if we do that, then we probably want to start using some classes or things to format them. So we have a section, and then we have a footer. On my web page, let me get my PowerPoint out of the way there. On our web page here, I refresh it. I don't see anything. All I've done is define the structure. Here's my heading section, my nav section, my aside, my section, and my footer that came off of the layout that we had planned for this page. In the next video, we'll start looking at ways we can style these and some CSS we can put on them to start making our page layout.